One of the Army's most sacred principles is that no one gets left behind. It's encoded in the various service creeds, like the Army's Soldier's Creed. Officers and NCOs are trained to maintain accountability of their troops at all times. Hollywood even works it into war movies. The upright, honorable soldier makes sure everyone comes home together, while leaving a soldier behind can portray tragedy or incompetence or even evil and corruption. And yet, in reality, this is war we're talking about. It's the extreme of the human condition. Combat sucks. You're either too hot or too cold, always tired, always dehydrated. Your body and brain are swimming in stress hormones while you're making life-changing decisions in the blink of an eye based on snippets of info that may or may not be true. And unfortunately, sometimes it means soldiers fail to live up to their own ideals. And that brings us to Vincent Charley's story. Vincent Charley was born sometime around 1848 in Lucerne, Switzerland. He immigrated to the U.S. and joined the Army in 1871. He told the recruiter he'd been a farmer. As an immigrant, Charley was hardly unique in the Army. Over 40% of the soldiers in the 7th Cavalry were immigrants, mainly from Ireland and Germany, but almost every European country was represented in the regiment. From captains on down, every rank had someone who had come to the United States from someplace else. Charley was a brawny, burly guy, and at 5 feet 10 inches tall, he just squeezed under the height requirement for joining the cavalry. There are no known photographs of Charley, but we know from Army records he had red hair and hazel eyes. Charley's life had not been an easy one. At only 27 years old, his body was already showing the wear and tear of someone much older. At some point, he had broken his right forearm and a bone in his right foot. Charley had pretty jacked up teeth and owed the Army $1 and change for tobacco. He probably didn't use it too much himself, though, but traded it or sold it to other soldiers. Back then, the Army relied heavily on the skill and expertise of recruits joining the service. It was cheaper than having to train someone up to do a particular job. For Vincent Charley, his time as a farmer gave him valuable knowledge the Army put to good use. Since he had experience working with animals, he became a farrier with Company D, 7th Cavalry. A farrier was basically the unit's veterinarian, looking after the health and welfare of the company's horses. He helped the troopers make sure their mounts were taken care of and worked with the company blacksmith to make sure the troopers' horses were properly shod. Charley's company commander was Captain Thomas Ware. Captain Ware had served extensively in the Civil War and was friendly with the Custers and their social circle. His second in command was Second Lieutenant Winfield Scott Edgerly, West Point class of 1870. Lieutenant Edgerly had been in a few skirmishes, but the Little Bighorn would be his first battle. On June 25, 1876, Captain Ware's company was assigned to Captain Frederick Bentine's battalion as they scouted the hills to the regiment's south for signs of hostile activity. After a few miles, they changed course and began riding back toward the rest of the unit. Along the way, they received a couple of messengers from Custer, including a trumpeter, Giovanni Martini, a.k.a. John Martin, carrying Custer's famous Last Order. Nearing the river, Bentine's battalion was beckoned by one of the Indian scouts to head up the bluffs, where they arrived just in time to see Major Marcus Reno's battalion struggling across the river and up the bluffs after their failed attack and retreat. Major Reno was excited, agitated, and, depending on who you ask, possibly tipsy. He beckoned Bentine to halt his men and help Reno out. Bentine immediately transitioned from riding toward Custer to organizing Reno's men. Within a few minutes of their arrival, the soldiers heard gunshots rapidly escalating to the north, including what could have been volley fire. It could only mean one thing: Custer was engaged. According to Edgerly, Captain Ware paced off anxiously, and Lieutenant Edgerly remarked to Company First Sergeant Michael Martin, "There must be General Custer. I guess he's getting away with them." The sergeant replied, "Yes, sir, and I think we ought to go there." A few minutes later, Captain Ware returned and asked if Edgerly would go with him and the company to Custer, even if nobody else would. Edgerly told him he would. Ware then said he would go ask Reno or Bentine for permission, and left. When Ware returned, he and his orderly immediately mounted their horses and started off northward, without a word. Edgerly figured he had gotten permission to go, and started the rest of the company after Ware. They rode about a mile or so north, toward the highest point around, now named Ware Point. When the soldiers reached the summit, Edgerly could see Indians riding all over the area to the north, appearing to fire into the ground. Bentine brought his company up, along with 2 others, and for roughly an hour or so, the soldiers traded long-range shots with the warriors. Bentine was heard to remark, "This is a hell of a place to fight Indians." He left to tell Major Reno their first spot was a better defensive position. Without him or any leader taking charge, the individual company commanders decided to retreat back to the rest of the unit. Captain Ware led Company D out, but Lieutenant Edgerly was having problems. The shooting had spooked his horse, and the horse kept swinging away from Edgerly when he would try to mount up. Lieutenant Edgerly's orderly, an old veteran, had to block Edgerly's horse from moving so he could finally get in the saddle. By this point, Indians had approached a mere feet away and were firing. Warriors began cresting the hill, right as Lieutenant Edgerly and his orderly galloped off, behind the rest of the soldiers. The Indians fired into the retreating troopers, knocking one off his horse. As Edgerly rode up, he saw the wounded man trying to crawl after his fellow soldiers. It was Vincent Charley. Charley said he had been shot through the hips and begged for help. Edgerly could see where Charley had cut his head from the fall off his horse and was bleeding. But there was no time. Warriors were already within yards of the men. As they left, Edgerly yelled to Charley to hide himself as best he could, and he would come back for him. He and his orderly had to resort to using their revolvers to keep the Indians at bay. As Edgerly looked back, he could see the Indians swarming over Charley. Edgerly later said when he caught up to Captain Ware, he asked to go back with some troopers and get Charley, but was denied permission. The entire command was in danger of being overrun and could not spare the men needed to save one wounded man who was probably already dead. After the battle, they found Vincent Charley where they had left him, with a stick rammed down his throat. Winfield Scott Edgerly would go on to lead a distinguished Army career, eventually becoming a brigadier general, but he was always haunted by his failure to save one of his soldiers. Shortly after the battle, he wrote to his wife regarding the incident, "That was the one thing I regretted more than any other thing that happened to me, for I had promised that wounded man I would get him out and wasn't able to raise a finger for him." The battle also changed Captain Ware. Already known as a heavy drinker, with most of his friends killed, Ware spiraled out of control. He was dead before the end of the year. Vincent Charley's body was hastily buried where he fell and was soon forgotten. No markers were placed for him, and there is no record of the Army attempting to retrieve his remains. In 1903, a battle survivor and the park superintendent exhumed 5 bodies from the Reno-Benteen area for reburial at the cemetery. Since there was no way of identifying the bones, the remains were listed as unknowns, until 1992, when the graves were re-exhumed and the bones examined by anthropologists. One of the skeletons had a clear gunshot through his right pelvic bone that came from behind him and slightly to his right. This, along with other matching physical descriptors, led researchers to positively identify Charley's remains. After over 100 years of being an unknown, farrier Charley was finally given a headstone with his name on it. A marker on the road between the Custer battlefield and the Reno-Benteen site shows the area where Charley was killed.